give or take, like the early 1900s when it sort of became playable. But in general, most people still were playing e5. So this definitely was surprising they played the French defense. So d4, d5, knight to c3, knight to f6. And one thing that's amazing, you guys, and this is why chess is a great game, is this opening the French defense, especially knight c3, knight f6. This is a system that's still played a lot. I've played this many times with both colors, and even now, more than 100 years later, this is still a major opening and a major setup for both sides. So e5, knight to d7, f4 is played here by Steinitz. Again, as I've said before, the history of chess is built upon the past masters, and f4 has been played a lot. Normally you can play either bishop g5 or you can play e5, and e5, knight d7, f4. I think this setup against this knight c3, knight f6 French, this is widely considered to be the best setup. I know like Fabiano has played this, I've played this, Magnus has played this. So building this big center with the 3 pawns is considered to be very it's considered to be one of the best setups that you can play against the French defense. And now if you think about it, this was also this game was played 135 140 years ago, before computers even existed. And you see, like Steinitz, he understood the concept of building the big center with the pawns. So c5, Steinitz takes. Nowadays normally white will play knight f3, knight c6, bishop to e3. This is more sort of traditional now, but anyway, after takes, bishop c5, knight f3, you got to develop. a6, bishop to d3. Oh, and by the way, yeah, you guys, this setup with the 3 pawns is it is considered the Steinitz defense, the Steinitz variation. Yes, this is true. So bishop to d3, knight c6. Again, you want the bishop on d3. It's on a really nice diagonal here. It's just placed very well. So queen e2, knight to b4 is played by Селман. Very logical move, by the way, to get rid of this knight's bishop that has a lot of scope on both of these diagonals. Okay, so knight b4, bishop to d2 is played by Steinitz. b5 is played here, knight to d1. Now this is also kind of an odd move. It's a move that's playable here, by the way, but it's not a move that I would expect people to consider in that time period. And this is just really deep understanding. Like the idea of playing knight d1 is twofold. What happens is after takes, first of all, you can reroute your knight to a better square. So let's just think about this conceptually. Let's say black goes here, or let's say you play, I don't know, let me just make a move. If you look at the knight on c3 here, it doesn't really have great targets. Like all of these pawns are protected. Like these 2 pawns are protected on b5 and b5 and d5. Secondly, the knight has no jumps. So knight on c3, really there aren't any squares for the knight to go to. So the knight isn't really doing a whole lot on c3 here. So the knight on c3, it's just like it's a bit iffy. So yeah, so the knight on c3 doesn't look great. So then we go back to the game. When Steinitz plays knight to d1 here, the point is that after knight d3, cd3, the knight can go to f2 or e3, where it's better placed for attacking on the king side, especially e3, because you might want to push this pawn to f5. But then secondly, you also open up the file for the rook. So it's basically a really deep positional move that makes makes a lot of sense to open up the c file, use the rook, and then replace your knight or reposition it on a better square where you can attack on the king side. So this happens in the game. So queen b6 is played here. Селман decides he wants to prevent white from castling the king here. So here Steinitz plays b4, another all-star move, really good positional move, really good understanding of what's going on, because after queen b6, b4, the bishop can no longer stay on this diagonal where it's really well placed. Instead, you have to go bishop to e7. Now Steinitz plays a3 and f5, rook c1. And what you'll see here is that basically by the bishop going away, now white can at some point put a piece on d4. Secondarily, you have an open file. And third, long term, you're going to be able to double or triple stack and really create a lot of threats on this uncontested file for the moment. So here bishop b7 is played by Селман. Steinitz goes bishop e3, queen to d8, only move, knight to d4, really nice move, again attacking the pawn on e6 to one vulnerable point, or the really vulnerable point in black's position. So knight to f8. Now Steinitz castles, and here Селман plays h5. Now the position already at this point is really bad at this point. I mean, g4 is a big threat here, but I don't even know what black's supposed to do. So he plays h5, basically just stopping g4 and f5, trying to close the king side of the board. So in a way, it's a very logical move in a sense to h5 is such a 19th century move. Okay, but I mean, to be fair, he's worried about g4. Like, I get it, he's worried about g4. And by the way, you just said 19th century move. 19th century move. 19th century move. It's a top move. It's a top move. It's a top move, you guys. Such a 19th century move, but it's the best move. Yeah, so anyway, h5 is played here. Science goes knight c3. Again, another really logical idea. So what you'll see, the reason that this is good is because where do you want your knight to be? And this game is more about positioning than anything else. It's like, where do you want your knight? If the knight goes here, maybe you can move it to g5, but again, there are no squares in the center. The pawns are holding all the squares. So what you do is you go knight to c3, and I think the idea is to move the queen and move the knight. Move the queen and move the knight to a better square where it supports the knight. And you'll see this, you'll see what happens here. So king f7 is played, knight to b1, g6, knight d2, and the whole point is that you can keep these pieces placed well, but you can reroute the knight to this side of the board, to b3 and to c5 or a5, versus the knight being on f2 where it really has no scope. So this is really good maneuvering. First, you think about it, he played knight to d1, then he goes back to c3, then he goes to b1. So it's, you know, it's like 1 2 3 4 5, and he's gonna go 6 and 7 and put the knight on a perfect square here. So knight to d7 is played. Now Steins goes knight b3, rook to c8. Again, white is probably winning here, but black has to try and contest the open file. Again, rooks are very strong when you can get them on open files like this. So now here knight a5 is played by Steinitz. Greg F goes bishop, sorry, my mind was somewhere else. Selman goes bishop to a8 here. Steinitz plays rook takes rook, queen takes rook, rook to c1 here. Selman plays queen to b8, and now here Steinitz plays queen to c2. And the reason he goes queen c2 is basically, again, try to take the open file and not let black contest it by putting a rook on c8 here. So now here bishop to d8 is played by Selman, again trying to get rid of this bishop. Now one thing that's really useful as well about this game that I would tell you guys is one of the problems with the French defense is look at this bishop on a8. It's a very sad bishop, and in the French defense very oftentimes you can end up with a bishop behind a big pawn wall like this, where this bishop is just it's out to lunch. It's not doing anything. All the diagonals are closed and your bishop is just completely dead in the corner here. And so when you play when you play the French, it's a very tough opening to play, because even if we go back to this opening, like you'll see very early on, you see this bishop is very bad. It's behind the pawn walls, and even without f5 it's behind pawn walls here. So when you play the French defense, you have to be very careful not to end up with a bad light square bishop, and that's one of the biggest drawbacks to playing the French defense in general. So all right, so let's keep going. So queen c2, bishop d8, again trying to get rid of this bishop on d8. Steins goes knight c6. Salman plays queen b7. Now he could have tried to take, but unfortunately after queen takes, both your knight and your pawn are under attack, so you have to go knight to f8 here. And now white can just very simply take the pawn here and play like rook c6 or rook c8. These pieces are doing very badly. You have a queen at bishop, but after like bishop b6, I just go rook c6 and takes. Your knight can't move, your rook is doing nothing, your queen is doing nothing, and it's just winning. So instead, after knight c6, Selman plays queen b7 here. Steinitz goes knight takes bishop, rook takes, and now he plays queen c7. Really beautiful move here. Again, you don't need something that's forced in order to win. You can just play very simple moves here, because after queen takes, queen, rook takes, you can't move the knight because it's pinned. You can't really move the king out of the pin, because then you lose this pawn. You can't move the rooks, then you lose the knight. Your bishop can't move either because all the squares are covered. So it's like you can't move any of your forces, and so it's eventually going to be zugzwang, and white is just completely winning. So Selman goes queen to b8 here. Steinitz goes bishop to f2, and this is also a really nice technical move. The idea is to play bishop h4, attack the rook, and if the rook ever goes off of d8, then you're going to lose your knight on d7, which it guards. So the whole point is a very nice finesse to bring the bishop here and target the rook on d8. So Selman goes queen to b6, trying to prevent it. Now here Steinitz goes knight f3. You can't go bishop h4. Actually, you probably can, but if you play bishop h4, black just takes the knight on d4. So instead, Steinitz goes knight f3. Very logical move. He fossils the queen on b6. He also moves the knight to a better square on f3, where it can go to g5 and attack the king. So Селман trades now, and after king to e8 tries to protect. Remember, in the previous position you couldn't do this because there was a knight on d4 winning the pawn on e6, but here the knight is on f3, so it's a little bit different. So Steinitz goes knight g5, puts the knight on a really nice square. This, by the way, is an outpost. The pawns are over pushed, so you can never put a pawn to attack the knight. So the knight on g5 is just golden here. So knight to f8. Steinitz goes bishop to c5, another very nasty positional move, threatening to go rook e7 checkmate. Knight to d7 is here, and now after bishop to d6, Селман resigns for a couple of reasons. First of all, you can't protect the pawn. If you go back, I make checkmate with the bishop and the rook. So you can't move the knight, you can't protect the pawn. Your bishop, again, is completely dead, no squares. Your rook is dead, and it's just going to be over in a handful of moves. So this was a really positional instructive game from Steinitz in terms of how to play against the French. And it's really important, like when you play the French or you get structures, especially these structures where you get 3 pawns like this, whether it's a French or it comes out of like a Caro-Kann or Sicilian, you have to be very mindful of getting a very bad light square bishop that is trapped behind pawns on light squares. But nonetheless, really nice game by Steinitz. I really like the ideas of this game, like playing knight to d1, and then, you know, b4 was good, but then also like at the right moment rerouting the knight back around. So it was like 1 2 3 4 5 6 7, and just really good positional understanding by Steinitz in converting this game and winning.